At Tiny Home Alliance Canada, we just love to share the amazing stories that can be found right here in our own community. We share these stories so our followers can learn more about tiny homes, the businesses that build them, and the people who live there.
There are a variety of reasons for living in a tiny house. While living tiny primarily represents a return to simpler living, the movement was also regarded as a potential eco-friendly solution to the existing housing industry, as well as a feasible transitional option for individuals experiencing a lack of shelter. But what is a tiny home, really? Is it just a small home under a certain area square? Should the term include bus conversions or someone living in their van? How about that 600-foot square home with a deck and a shed out back? These have all been considered a tiny home by someone, but if you ask me, I'd say we've let things get a little out of hand. The distinction is important as more people look to place tiny homes on empty lots, especially in municipal areas. It seems like the perfect solution until you look into it a bit deeper. We find that descriptions, or the language we use around tiny homes, has become a gray area in need of clarification. We tend to see anything that isn't a traditional home as a tiny home. Even the vans and converted buses are considered tiny homes in general. And while I understand why this happened, some of us feel that if this industry is going to see any growth, we really must define what a tiny home truly is and give ourselves a solid foundation to work from. Today on Tiny Home Heroes, I have Terrilee Kelford from Ottawa, Ontario. She is the co-host of Tiny Home Talk Canada podcast, co-chair at National Alliance to End Rural and Remote Homelessness. Plus, she is also owner and CEO at Kelford Youth Services. Terrilee is an active member of the community and recently pointed out the difficulties in misidentifying what a tiny home really is, and that really struck a chord with me. So let's get to it. Welcome to the show, Terrilee. It's great to have you here once again. How are you doing?
Thanks, Frank. Good to be back.
So you had made a post on Facebook, and that's really what got this conversation started. And your post, I should have brought it up actually. And I just thought about that now. And the post was generally a bit of a heated comment about why is everything considered a tiny home house now? Tell me why you made that post. What sort of led up to that? And maybe we can go on to speaking about solutions. So let us know what prompted that post.
Yeah, I think a few things. I think I think you would notice the same thing, that the discussion around tiny homes has exploded over the last few years. There's more social media sites about tiny homes, more people sharing stories about living tiny. But I feel like we're still in the same place. There hasn't really been a lot of changes to legislation over the last 4 or 5 years, even though there's been this explosion of discussion. We're seeing some small examples of tiny home villages and communities. We're seeing changes to provincial legislation. Certainly I can speak to Ontario anyways around secondary suite legislation, and we can talk more about that. But if I go back to when we, as a charity in Leonard County, just outside of Ottawa, looked at partnering with Algonquin College to build a tiny house on wheels for youth housing, I own my responsibility for not doing more due diligence in terms of investigating legal pathways to compliance for tiny homes on trailers. I had seen pictures and websites and all kinds of people talking about tiny homes. And there was even some sites I went to that said legal tiny homes all across Canada. But when you actually look into each of those examples, they weren't really legal examples. There's been perhaps exceptions to the rules made across Canada, but there's never been a clear pathway to legal compliance for tiny homes on trailers in Canada, period. End of story. And so we're still struggling with that now. We built a tiny home for youth housing with Algonquin College, and 3 years later, it's still vacant because we can't legally get it on the ground. And there's been changes in Ontario to the Ontario Building Code. We're ecstatic about that. You and I have talked about that before. And I think those are the tangible pieces of legislation that need to change. I think the next biggest one is going to be planning barriers when it comes to tiny homes on trailers. Don't get me wrong, there's still some code issues I think that need to be clarified, not necessarily changed. But I do think that if people are going to call themselves tiny home advocates and claim to be pushing for changes to legislation, then they need to be clear about what they're asking for and what changes they're looking for. And they can't conflate the issue of legal pathways to tiny homes with things like campers and vans and all those other pieces that people may refer to as tiny homes. I think it confuses the issue. And does it frustrate me? Yes. Partially because I have had so many people call me. I still regularly, once a week, have someone calling me asking me about how to get a tiny home and a trailer on property somewhere legally. And I always feel like the bad person because I'm having to say to them, you probably can't. Here's what you're going to have to do if you want to get that compliant. And so they're under the impression, though, from the websites they see, the groups they participate in, that tiny homes and trailers are legal and that people have them everywhere. That's their impression. They are shocked when I say to them, you cannot legally own a tiny home that you built yourself. If you built it before a year and a half ago, it's not legal unless you had it built by a home manufacturer. That was the only pathway to build a tiny home and a trailer. And even then, you're probably going to have planning and legislation barriers. So again, I feel like the bad guy because I'm always saying to you, you probably can't do this yet. But the frustration I think I have is from the tiny home movement that is miseducating the public and also looking at tiny homes or discussing tiny homes as an affordable housing option. It's not an affordable housing option if we as an industry encourage people to spend their life savings on a trailer, tiny home and a trailer that they'll never be able to legally live in. That is devastating to someone because as we know, real resale value on these without being legally built is terrible. So essentially they've lost all their money on a house they'll never live in. So it comes from all of that. It comes from a whole gamut of history, our own history in terms of building a tiny house that we still haven't been able to use yet. Hearing these stories from folks who genuinely lead affordable housing to live in, and then seeing an industry that is all over the map in terms of their advocacy. And I think, now we're also seeing this current trend to profit off the advocacy around tiny homes and people calling themselves consultants and selling books and guides and courses and all sort of stuff. And so I think it's dangerous for those who are looking for affordable options who then waste their money on things that are not legal. And that was my rant on social media.
Well, and it was a good rant because it was very succinct and it was very to the point, and I think really, really realistic in that we tend now to find anything that could be considered alternative living. Suddenly we're just lumping into this tiny home thing. And to me, that's not really the issue. That's just the cause of the issue. And to me, the issue is that since we can't truly define what a tiny home is, how are we supposed to get legislation done on that? The government's saying, okay, you want to legalize these things. Okay, what are they? Define it for me. And we're going, oh, well, it's a van, it's a bus, it's a house, it's a shed, and they're like, well, you need to go back and figure out what you guys are doing, and then we'll listen. And that's why it's not being listened to, in my humble opinion, because the clarification isn't there. So the distinction between first tiny home on wheels and a tiny home on the ground. So let's say I have two identical tiny homes. Yeah. And let's say for this instance, they are actual tiny homes, like a purpose-built tiny home, under 400 square feet. One of them has wheels on a trailer. The other one was built on a movable foundation. Mm-hmm. In your opinion, what is the distinction between those? Because you have made a distinction between a tiny home on wheels and otherwise.
Yeah. So tiny home built on a foundation is really just a small house. And really the only barrier to that has been planning, not building code. Building code has always permitted, National Building Code in Canada has always permitted tiny homes as small as 145.36 square feet plus bathroom and laundry. So tiny homes have always been legally permissible in Canada. What happened was planning legislation started to require people to build larger homes. And I've heard all kinds of reasons for that historically as to why that happened, from tax dollars to all kinds of stuff. But, and the bigger is better mantra within the housing sector, right? But so you can build a tiny house legally under code to 200 square feet, if that's what you want to do today, right now, always have been able to. But planning legislation ruled out things like secondary units. They created zoning bylaws that said single family homes could only be a 950 square feet minimum. So it was really a planning issue that started to interfere with that. And planning can be changed as well, just like code. Sorry, I got a phone ringing here in the background. and I think that, so like changes in Ontario again through the Provincial Planning Act, where they're now permitting 2 secondary units or additional dwelling units per property, are starting to change that as well. Going before council, which I've done many times, and asking them to remove their minimum square footage requirements for single family homes. Simple ask. It's a very clear ask. Just go and ask for it in front of your council or write letters. The tiny homes on trailers is much more complicated, and that's what we're running into ourselves right now. So we bought a property for youth housing in Perth. We've used the main house, 3-bedroom house, as a transitional house for young people, 16 to 24. And then we purposely built in the town of Perth because they had adopted or changed their official plan and bylaws to accommodate secondary units. So you're allowed to have 2 secondary units per property in the town of Perth. One is attached to the house, one is detached from the house. So we've converted an addition on the back of the house into a 1-bedroom apartment, just launching it in the next couple of weeks. It'll be one of the first secondary units used specifically for affordable housing in Leonard County. And then we plan to hopefully use the tiny home as a detached secondary unit in the backyard, but our tiny home is on a trailer. So the planning, interestingly in Perth, the planning legislation is not necessarily a barrier, other than they have written in some bylaws into the town of Perth, which is quite common, that you can't live in for permanent residency anything that can propel itself. That's kind of language they use in planning. So in other words, you can't live in an RV on a town property. You can't live in something that can move itself or be moved. And so all of that was designed to prevent RVs from being used and campers from being used as permanent housing. But unfortunately, it's now had this effect of also affecting tiny homes on wheels, even if they were built to code. And so then the other factor that we're struggling with, and we're communicating with the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing in Ontario about, is the issue of trailers. There seems to be a lot of confusion amongst building inspectors and chief building officials and planners around trailers and how that impacts meeting code for a house to be on a foundation. To live in a house year round for permanent residency, it has to be on a foundation. It cannot just be floating. So that's why the wheels become problematic and people get confused by wheels. So they'll say, you're going to take the wheels off. Taking the wheels off is a lot more complicated than just taking the wheels off. It actually means you have to tie and skirt it and anchor it to a foundation for it to be legal, which we are going to do. We're planning on doing that. But we're still stuck in a bit of a debate around the legal implications of a trailer and how that affects the actual connection to a foundation. So that's where we're at. We're trying to get some answers from the ministry to help clarify that issue. That seems to be the last stumbling block that we're experiencing in terms of actually being able to finally use our tiny home legally. So it's complicated, a lot more complicated than just building on a foundation. We could start tomorrow and apply for a secondary unit permit to build a secondary detached unit in Perth and start doing it in the fall. Pretty straightforward. Submit your drawings, meet with the town, good to go, because that's permitted according to planning and building code. So, but the tiny home and the trailer is still problematic. And that's why we don't have really tangible legal examples across Canada. So, and again, I've been reached out to by many people who have tiny homes on trailers that want to use them legally, but they're either having to hide them somewhere or get someone to secretly give them permission to park it on their property. Or I just toured a woman's property outside of Ottawa a couple of months ago, where she had, permitted 4 tiny homes to be on her property, and they all got evicted. So it's 7 people were living in those 4 tiny homes who are now no place to put those tiny homes. So we have to get past these legal hurdles, and we have to be specific. Something I learned as co-chair of the National Alliance to End Rural Homelessness, going before ministers and asking for something specific from the government when it comes to funding asks or policy change asks or those sorts of pieces, is you have to be very clear. You cannot be gray. There's no room for gray.
Agreed.
If you want changes to law and planning, you have to be specific. And very smart people working on housing and homelessness on a national level said to me, what are your asks? Come up with 3 asks, and that's what you ask repeatedly for. And that's what I do when I'm trying to advocate for legal pathways to change when it comes to tiny homes.
It seems that the big barrier for a tiny home is the wheels, the trailer itself. I have a few questions that I might ask about that, but one that really comes to mind is the idea that a lot of people that are trying to insure their tiny homes and get their tiny home somewhere, they bend over and they go to an RV dealership and they get it insured as an RV. And now on the books, it doesn't matter what you call it, you could call it an Apple, but it's still an RV in legal standards. Now, more people do that, and it becomes sort of the standard thing to do. And then the perception, not the reality, but the perception then is that, in the government, it's an RV, even if it's a tiny home, if it's on wheels, the perception is it's an RV, and that's a full stop. Now, most people are building these things in there and they're wanting to just put them somewhere. I wonder why the wheels? Why do people need to have wheels in their tiny homes at all? Why couldn't we just skirt this whole problem and stop building tiny homes on wheels?
Yeah, we could. I think the recent push for tiny homes on wheels is because of the cost of housing right now. And I think, I just had this conversation with the planner in the town of Perth a few weeks ago. People can't afford land and a house, so they're buying a house. And they're hoping they're going to find somebody who's going to rent them land.
Well, it's a big risk.
It is a big risk. It's a huge risk right now because really it's almost impossible to legally do that. So, or it's very expensive to do it because you're actually legally supposed to hook up to services. And anyways, it's very complicated. It's not just as simple as parking like an RV on a property. So I think that's part of the issue, though, is people are like, if I have $50,000 and I can buy a secondhand tiny home on a trailer, should I do that? Because a property is going to cost me 60, 70, 80, $100,000. So if I can just put my money into a tiny home, at least I have a roof over my house, a roof over my head, and then I'll try to find land to park it, even if that means secretly somewhere. And so that's what we're seeing. We're seeing people out of desperation, I think, really, because they can't find housing, relying on these pieces, and then being completely blown under the water when it comes to finding legal pathways to actually use the house, and being devastated when they find out that they bought a house that they'll never legally be allowed to use because it wasn't built through code or it wasn't built by a home manufacturer. And I think that is so tragic to me. I actually hate having that conversation with people because I know that it's just so disheartening that they've wasted money on this house that they'll never be able to use.
I think the solution is going to be about getting to a position where you don't need to tell people that's probably not going to work, and instead being able to change the conversation to, well, let me show you how you can make this work. It's the same sentence said a little bit differently, but one is far more positive than the other. So let's move on with that and say, if we were going to change the culture and the language around tiny homes in order to help municipalities and governments sort of clarify things, like you said, what are your three asks? Maybe we could define, how do we do that? What are those three asks? It's a hard conversation to have because we know what needs to be done, but how do you really go about do that? So have you come up with any kind of plan to help with this?
Yeah, I think, the next piece that we're tackling, we've kind of done it like step by step, in the sense that we really addressed planning issues in Leonard County. And when we built our tiny home, CBC picked up on it and there was lots of media coverage. And I was invited by the province, the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, to speak at planners authority meetings and be on webinars and stuff with them. So there was like a real bit of a movement discussion around how do we do this? And it actually became more planning issues that became an issue because people were they were confused by how to draft bylaws that would permit something on a trailer. They were really confused by the wheels, confused by the trailer, confused by how the trailer connects to a foundation. And so because we haven't had a lot of legal examples of that happening, there aren't any examples to refer to. And I actually called the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing in Ontario, the planning department, just a few months ago and said, do you have a repository of bylaws? Like you've allowed for example, secondary units, detached and attached in the province of Ontario. Do you guys keep samples of bylaws? And they said, no, there's no repository. So even if one county somewhere, a municipality in Ontario drafts a bylaw, there's no record of that the ministry keeps that you can refer to. So it means that so it means it's also duplication and a waste of money, because what it means is that each township has to hire their planner or pay their planner to, some have them on staff, have planners on staff, and some don't. They have to use consultants. And so they have to reinvent the wheel every single time and have public consultation and debate these issues every single time. And you can't just go to a site, for example, for samples of these bylaws. So we hope in the town of Perth, we're going to have to do a site-specific zoning amendment for our tiny house. But then we hope as a result of that, the town of Perth will actually change their official plan and their zoning bylaw in general to allow for rules around tiny homes and trailers. And then that will become a legal example of a tiny home. We could have technically in with Cornerstone, we could have just knocked the trailer off, made it disabled and put it on a foundation and called it a day. But we did commit to this being a pilot project 3 years ago. And I think all the conversations I've had with people right across the country who are interested in this form of housing, based on the housing and homelessness crisis we find ourselves in Canada, Canada. I think we need all options on the table. And this is one that people are desperately asking for. So why not find legal ways to make it happen? And our goal has always been legal pathways. I'm not going to advocate for housing in which people are going to be evicted from. I'm always going to advocate for housing that's legal, that people have a right to live in. If housing is going to be a human right, we have to find legal pathways for people to be able to have affordable housing options. So I think, again, we have to go back to these really clear asks. Changing the Ontario Building Code was one of them. We need more flexibility for people to build their own tiny houses and not have to rely on home manufacturers all the time. We have to have changes to planning code. So that's what we've been asking. Get rid of your minimum square footage requirements, allow for secondary units or additional dwelling units. And then this last piece that we're advocating for is to figure out the trailer piece. So I think it's a little bit more complicated when it's 3 asks. If I'm going to the federal government asking for money, it's clear, bang, 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 here what we're asking for. But when it comes to building, it's the overlap between the Planning Act and the Building Code that you have to be conscious of. So, and to go back to something you said about RVs too, Frank, I think that we need to be cautious. It's kind of the chicken and the egg debate, right? Like, we got insurance on our tiny home, but it wasn't RV insurance. We actually went to cooperators, and now we've got another person covering it for us. It costs more because it's on a trailer and it can be stolen. So therefore you need theft insurance on your house. But as soon as it's anchored to a foundation, it becomes a regular house. And I know that RV companies have approached me over the years too and said, hey, we'll offer financing. I never advertise it, not because I'm not grateful for options for people, but because I don't want to conflate the issue. I can't say to planners and building officials, it's not an RV, and then use RV insurance and RV financing and RV. So somehow we got to draw a line between those two things, and not just in our language, but in the actual practical aspects of what we're trying to ask for changes to. We can't have our cake and eat it too, is what I'm saying. And I know people are doing it out of desperation because there's no other options. But if we don't keep asking for what we legally need clearly and not conflating the issues, we're never going to get there, because they're always going to defer us back to RVs and back to campers and back to, right?
So you're saying this takes active advocacy from all sides.
Needs to be clear, yes. So we can't, I wish that people would not have tiny home websites that have tiny homes on trailers on them, and then also campers and vans and campgrounds and all this sort of stuff, right? Because that's the piece that really confuses people. And I know it happens on almost every website I see. I'm not talking about you folks.
And I don't know, how do you get, like, how do we deal with that? We want to support our community, but at the same time, we can't have these people reinforcing a misnomer like that.
Yeah, look, I think there's a place for that, right? I think like people driving around in vans and traveling the world and doing podcasts is certainly a cool little industry, right? Mm-hmm. I just think we need to find another term for it than tiny house, because
I have one.
What's that?
Alternative living.
Perfect. Yes, perfect.
It even sounds cool, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think start the trend.
Right. And that's why I wanted to have this conversation, Terrilee.
Yes.
It's not just about getting your opinion about things. It's like the question, the big one: how do we change the language and thus change the culture, with the result of higher understanding on the levels of government and parliament, things like that?
So Frank, what would be required is for folks like you and I, who are in this sector trying to make changes, to then set up websites that are called alternative living and make all those posts there, because then you start to change the language. So if you want to make changes, you got to direct the traffic. And so that would be a really good idea. Set up social media sites that called alternative housing and put it over there. And then tiny homes are specific to what we're legally trying to get changes around. I say we, because I do think that regardless of what people are talking about, there is a movement to try to look at affordable housing options for folks. I just think most people are really unclear about what the laws actually are and what they have to do to change it. I've learned a lot in my role as co-chair of a national alliance, because I've had to sit before ministers and ask for changes to policy and funding. And that was a huge learning curve for me. I had to listen from colleagues and learn from colleagues and friends and change what I was saying and how I was saying it as well, to be clear. So I think the same thing happens. I mean, when I was invited to Toronto by the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing to consult on the guide that was created in Ontario for tiny homes, And there was advocates as part of that, and they did more than one day. And even the advocates that were invited to the consultation still weren't aware that you couldn't legally build a tiny home and trailer and put it anywhere in Ontario at that time. That was before the changes to the Ontario Building Code. And so again, even at that consultation, I felt like the bad person, because I was like, look, you're a Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, you're putting out a guide, buyer beware. That needs to be part of the message of the guide. Here's what you can do, here's what you can't do. And it needs to be clear, because you cannot set up the public for failure by putting out a guide with pictures of tiny homes and trailers on it and making it look like this is easy. It's not easy. It's very complicated. So, and subsequently there was changes to the Ontario Building Code after that happened. So again, I think even people calling themselves advocates, I got asked recently, are you a tiny home expert? And I said, no. I had never used the term expert ever about any topic, no matter how long I've been doing it, because I'm constantly learning. I don't know what it would be required to call yourself an expert, actually. So have I learned a lot? Absolutely. But I'm still learning. And I don't think we've got enough legal, tangible examples out there to really claim to be an expert on anything in this right now. And I'm constantly relying on structural engineers and architects and building inspectors in the ministry to consult and get information from, and legal examples and case law and all that sort of stuff. So I could not have done any of that without all of those people that I'm still constantly consulting into this day. So we have to rely on other experts. I think that's my advice on most of the pages I see about tiny homes as well, is look, you can listen to all of us ranting and raving on Facebook sites and social media sites, but if you want a tiny home of any type, whether it's on a trailer or on a foundation, call your local municipality that you're going to be building it in or putting it in, and ask the planning department and the building inspectors if they'll permit it. There's flexibility in each municipality, so be cautious about that. Don't just take it as a no and you can't have it. You may have to call around to different municipalities if you have the flexibility of moving or building in different locations. But those are the people who are going to tell you what you can legally or not legally do. Do not get confused by the advocacy you see in social media. It's dangerous, and you can waste a lot of money doing that. So make sure that you're calling the local planning department and the building department.
That's an interesting point. So, as we've been talking today, we've been speaking mostly about, Ontario, the area that you live in, because that's your area of experience.
Yeah.
But don't you think that it would be more worthwhile to not concentrate so much on just our little municipalities and try to really make this a national thing where there's a national code allowing tiny homes to be insured code, where there's no gray areas and things like that? I know that's a huge ask. Mm-hmm. But I've noticed that most of the people I talk to, it's all very centered on their own area in Alberta, or I'm in BC, or I'm in Ontario. And there's not a lot of conversation around how do we move that up? How do we take the next big step and make this a national thing? Is there a way to do that, do you think?
Well, because there's a bit of a confusing issue here. It's about interpretation of law. The National Building Code technically does not prevent you from building a tiny home and a trailer and using it to live in year round.
Well, no, but we're talking about the rules, not like, because I could go out today and build myself a tiny home, but can I live in it? Can I put it somewhere? That's the issues. Really, the issues isn't trying to build your tiny home.
Yeah.
The issue is, once I'm done with it, what will I do with it, but what am I allowed to do with it? You're like a teenager trying to do stuff at home, and your dad and mom saying, no, can't do that. No, you can't do that. I don't care if you made it already. You can't use it here. And that's kind of what's happening. Big Brother is saying, great work. Glad you worked for a year and a half on your tiny home, but I'm sorry, the rules don't allow for you to put it anywhere.
Right. So again, the building code doesn't necessarily prevent you from doing any of that. The change that happened in Ontario was simply to allow local building inspectors to inspect tiny homes sort of out of the order of a normal house that's being built on a foundation. Normally, if you pulled a permit to build a house of any size, you would have a foundation first, and that would be inspected. You build the frame, and that would be inspected. There's a stages. In Ontario, it now says that you can actually build on a trailer in one location. You still pull a permit in that location. The building inspector comes out, inspects that portion of the build, and then you have to have it inspected in the next municipality if you move it somewhere else for the foundation piece. So it's really just a changing of ordering, which I don't think there really was even a requirement to go in that order. It was just standard and accepted that that's what you did, foundation, framing, and up. But now it allows you to build a house essentially and move it between municipalities, but still have it inspected by a local building inspector. That's all that was really changed. Size, trailer, all those sorts of issues, according to the building code, is actually not an issue. This is part of what I'm running into right now in Perth. When I talk to the ministry building department, they say the trailer is not a problem. When I talk to our local municipalities, they say the trailer is a problem. I can't get those two parties to come to a consensus. So one party says this, one party says that. I'm in the middle trying to figure it out. One sends me case law, one says that's not accurate, and then I'm stuck in the middle. So we're hoping to get, again, some legal opinion from the ministry that would address this confusion that people have around the trailer. We talked to a structural engineer to hire a structural engineer to design the foundation to anchor our house to a foundation. And they said it was a no-brainer, it was no big deal, they could do it. But then I go back to the local building official and they say, no, it's not acceptable. So, so that's where we're sort of stuck in. But when you're talking about national advocacy, here's what I believe. I think, this is just my approach, I'm not saying that's the right and only approach. I think that if we get legal, tangible examples of this done in small communities, we can use those to advocate for the national change we want. Sometimes innovation is small, you know this, right? And so if you want to challenge something, sometimes it's easier to do it in a little small box than it is to try to go national, right? And I think part of the issue is if you went to the National Building Code folks, they'd say there's no real barriers to tiny homes and trailers now. So that's kind of the struggle. They would say it's more about a planning issue.
No, that's so true. And I don't want people listening right now to this podcast saying, thinking to themselves, that I'm hearing nothing but problems and, becoming a little bit maybe discouraged perhaps. But listen, as we're talking about this, this conversation and many others, those small steps are happening. It's hard to see real change when you're in the middle of the storm. We can't really see what's happening on the outskirts. We just hope that the steps that we make and the things that we do can have some positive change, in the world around us.
Yeah, agreed. And look at Ontario actually wasn't the first province to change to define tiny homes as 400 square feet or less, or to allow for permits in other areas. Nova Scotia actually was. So there is changes happening across the province. I mean, there's a national building code, but then each province is allowed to interpret that for each provincial jurisdiction as well. So the provincial changes can actually affect the code if that's necessary, right? But the national code tends to be more liberal than the provincial codes are, right? The provincial codes actually become more restrictive.
I'm really starting to get the impression that the problem or the challenge, I hate to say the word problem there, that the challenge is less what I thought it was at the beginning of this conversation, which was really the language, people calling tiny, vans are, RVs, tiny homes and things like that. And I'm starting to realize that perhaps the issue is these different groups that make different decisions in the building and where you're going to live in your tiny home. Like you said, that one group says, perfectly fine, go ahead, we don't have a problem with that. And then you go talk to the other, say, hey, dad, mom said it was okay. And dad says, no, it's not okay. And, perhaps that's where the challenge could be met in what you're obviously doing is trying to get those two people to talk to each other, not just to you in one ear and the other person in the other. They need to get together in the same room, right, and really speak to each other and come up with a standard way of discussing these things. When somebody comes in and they want permitting, then they have a way of liaising with each other and saying, okay, how do we get this done, rather than just telling people no. Maybe that really is the underlying issue, not the wheels, not the buses, not the language. And I really do think the language is important, but really just the way that these different groups don't talk to each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the way the system is created. In other words, the province is not really allowed to tell the municipalities what they're supposed to do, not supposed to do. And the municipalities advocate and fight for the right to decide for their own community, their own unique features and laws and aspects, right? It is a flaw in the planning system as far as I'm concerned. I talk about legislated NIMBYism because I think local planners and elected officials can build in NIMBY sort of concepts around planning legislation. So like, for example, we have a recent township here in Leonard County who said that detached secondary units were only permitted on properties with a minimum of 20 acres. There's absolutely no research, no evidence, no information that would defend or support that position. They just created a law because essentially they don't want detached secondary units in their community. So, and I've sat before that council before, so I heard the comments that were coming out that it would devalue properties and all this sort of stuff. So, so the Planning Act has a lot more flexibility in it to influence and legislate biases, which is really unfortunate, which brings us back to the original topic. And I think advocates have to be careful because I've sat in a room with a lot of elected officials and municipal councils who have the right to pass laws in their community that permit or or refuse certain types of buildings, and they are confused by the RV versus the tiny home and a trailer discussion. They see them as the same thing, and they don't want RVs or mobile homes or whatever it is that they conflate the issue with in their township. And so again, that language piece is extremely important, right?
They're not looking at documentation for their definitions. They're simply forming the definitions out of their personal experience, their personal opinions,
or biases. Yeah. Or prejudices, right? Like a lot of the resistance I hear on a local municipal level about tiny homes is devaluing property values, including just for standard secondary units that are built on a foundation. We don't want those in our community. That'll devalue my property, when in fact actually it should increase the value of your property. So, but if they get that stuck in their head, then they can turn down a vote to permit a zoning bylaw that would allow for secondary units. Now, I mean, it's a bit of a, and the Planning Act is a bit passive aggressive too, like because the Provincial Planning Act in Ontario specifically says that secondary units are permitted as of right. That's why it's written into the Provincial Planning Act, which means townships can then pass ridiculous bylaws like you can only have a detached secondary unit on a property with a minimum of 20 acres. But anybody in that township could actually appeal that, apply for zoning, site-specific zoning amendment, appeal that. And if it went to the provincial level, they would win because the Provincial Planning Act would actually back up, and that township would have to create evidence and research to document why 20 acres is necessary for their community. So, but it's a really passive aggressive way because you have to have the money typically to hire lawyers and go to court and to be able to justify why you should be allowed that tiny home when the Provincial Planning Act is very clear in saying it should be allowed as right. So the Planning Act in Ontario is a huge barrier to affordable housing options as far as I'm concerned, the way it's designed. So it's definitely a piece that needs to be changed. But again, if anybody out there has, here's my pitch to your audience. If anybody out there has tangible bylaws or examples of zoning amendments or official plan definitions that permit tiny home on wheels, put them all over social media. That's what you should be sharing. Give people the legal examples that they can use to go back to their township and advocate for change. When we get our zoning amendment done, assuming that it gets passed, I will be blasting it everywhere and sharing it everywhere because I want people to have that, to be able to have it in their hands and go to their local planner and building inspector and say, here's what they did in Leonard County. And you guys can do it too. It's just a sample. That's what we need. If we get more of those, it doesn't matter what provinces it is or where in Canada, if we get more of those tangible examples of specific and not site specific, don't get me wrong, mine's going to be site specific initially, but we hope there's going to be a tangible change after that. We'll still share our site specific zoning amendment. That means it only applies to our little property. And that's not good enough for me. I think there needs to be county-wide, municipal-wide changes to official plans and bylaws. But that's where you start, right? That's the first step, is getting some of those legal examples and then using that to advocate for increased change. So, so if anybody out there has any of those, if you've managed to get changes in your local municipality to allow you to use a tiny home and a trailer, share it everywhere, blast it everywhere. That's what's required to get the changes done that we need.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And for my part, anybody out there that has that information that Terrilee just mentioned, get a hold of Tiny Home Alliance, get a hold of us, post it, give me a call, send me an email. Let's have an interview. Let's talk about it. Let's make videos. Let's make podcasts. Let's, my power is creating content. I'm not a politician. I'm not a speaker. My power is to be able to just share not my ideas, but your ideas and your thoughts and your insights with people. And Terrilee, I love chatting with you about this stuff because you're humble enough to know that you don't know everything, but I get the impression you know a lot more than you think, and that makes for great conversation. And I think this conversation around the culture of tiny homes, and then getting people to advocate in the proper way, not just advocate saying, "Oh, I love tiny homes." That's not really advocacy. Yeah. It's what you're talking about: writing letters, starting a website, careful about what you post and the language you use in your posts. And I think that's really, really important. So I think we're going to kind of end this conversation here. So thanks a lot for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me. It's a good conversation.
We're definitely going to have you on again when you do that other any big things you do, Terrilee. I'll know it, and I'll probably send you a message. Hey, let's talk about that. So thanks everyone else for joining us today with Terrilee Kelford, talking about the language and culture around tiny homes. If you want to see more videos like this and you like our content, please come join Tiny Home Alliance as a member on Patreon. You can find us on Patreon at Tiny Home Alliance Canada. There's lots of great tiers to join and help us out. The more we do, the better we do. The more advocacy we can create. We can get into Parliament. We can start writing letters, and we can do a lot more stuff like that. Plus, give you guys, again, all this great content. So join us on Facebook, Instagram, Patreon, all that wonderful stuff. Thanks everybody for joining us, and we will talk to you later. So remember, go big, living tiny. Bye everyone.